The annual harvest festival at St. Aldhelm in the Weald had concluded with the particular satisfaction that comes when a village has done itself proud. The parish hall, festooned with late chrysanthemums and sheaves of golden wheat, had echoed with laughter and the cheerful scraping of fiddles until well past 10 o'clock. Miss Jane Marple, who had contributed a modest apple tart and spent the evening observing the intricate social dance of village life, walked home along Church Lane with her shawl drawn close against the October chill, and a small smile for the way people revealed themselves when they thought no one of consequence was watching. The evening had been particularly illuminating. Mr. Silas Blackwood, the church warden, had held court near the refreshment tables with his usual mixture of civic pride and pointed criticism. "Excellent elderberry preserves, Mrs. Henderson," he had announced in his carrying voice, "though perhaps next year we might consider a touch less sugar." Mrs. Henderson had smiled with the practiced grace of a woman who had endured 40 years of such observations, but Miss Marple had noted the slight tightening around her eyes. Mr. Blackwood was a man of considerable means and even more considerable opinions, generous with both his donations to the church and his commentary on everyone else's contributions. Colonel Melbury, whose hair had retreated at the first sound of distant cannon, but whose moustache had held the line admirably, had pronounced the evening a capital success, while his wife, with the implacable benevolence of someone who had managed regimental households across the empire, had quietly corrected his more enthusiastic assessments. The vicar, Reverend Edmund Parry, had moved through the crowd with the mild satisfaction of a man whose flock had behaved itself admirably, while Mrs. Bostock, the formidable church warden, had supervised the clearing with the efficiency of a victorious admiral. Miss Marple had particularly enjoyed watching the interplay between the newer residents and the established families. Mrs. Pember, the rather glamorously appointed woman who had taken the cottage near the green, had provided several elegant dishes that spoke of London bakeries rather than village ovens, though she had been gracious about accepting compliments. Mr. Lionel Quayle, who had recently opened an antiques shop with remarkably glossy price tags, had listened with apparent fascination to the local histories, while his eyes held the calculating gleam of someone cataloguing potential acquisitions. The village had settled into sleep with the comfortable expectation of waking to itself unchanged, as villages generally do. A dog had barked twice at some nocturnal disturbance and thought better of continuing. Young couples had parted beneath the ancient chestnuts, with kisses made awkward by their importance. At the Black Badger, the last patrons had departed with the measured steps of men who knew their wives, were counting the minutes. Miss Marple, in her neat bedroom with the ivory-backed brush set she had never quite had the heart to replace, had been counting her hairpins when the great bell of St. Aldhelm's began to toll. It was precisely 23 minutes past midnight when the bronze voice of the church bell shattered the village peace. Not the cheerful peal that announced Sunday services or the measured tolling that marked funerals, but something altogether more urgent and disturbing. One strike, two, three, and then a tumbling rush of sound that seemed to beat against cottage walls with indecent force. The bell had not rung at such an hour within living memory, not since the night of the great fire that had claimed half the village 2 centuries past. Miss Marple sat up in bed, her mind immediately alert. In 73 years of village life, she had learned to distinguish between the sounds that meant mischief and those that meant genuine trouble. This bell spoke of the latter. She reached for her spectacles and cardigan, moving with the deliberate efficiency of someone who had long ago learned that emergencies waited for no one's convenience. By the time she reached the lich gate, a small crowd had gathered, their faces pale in the moonlight, and their voices hushed with the particular anxiety that comes when familiar patterns are violently disrupted. P.C. Luke Reed, round-cheeked and earnest in his authority, was fastening his uniform buttons as he approached from the station house. The vicar appeared with his dressing gown tucked oddly into his trousers, murmuring, "Dear me," at intervals that served as punctuation for a mind hastily assembling appropriate responses to crisis. "It's coming from the tower," announced Mrs. Bostock, magnificent in a military-style coat that could have discouraged wolves. "Someone's up there with no business being there, mark my words." The bell ceased as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind an echo that seemed to throb in the sudden silence. The church door stood slightly ajar, though Miss Marple was quite certain it had been properly secured after the evening's festivities. A thin line of light showed beneath, suggesting that someone had lit the altar candles in considerable haste. "Stay where you are," P.C. Reed called, making a brave island of himself at the entrance to the nave. "No one goes in until we know what's what." But even as he spoke, a sound came from within the church that made several of the assembled villagers step backward involuntarily. Not the bell this time, but a heavy thud, followed by what could only be described as a woman's startled cry, quickly stifled. Dr. Harold Pike, whose practice had taught him to respond to emergencies with calm efficiency, reached the threshold at the same moment as Miss Marple. Their eyes met briefly, and he inclined his head in acknowledgement of her presence. Together, they stepped into the nave. The interior was lit by two hastily placed candles, whose golden light flickered across memorial plaques and caught the brass lectern in a way that made it seem to move. The rope to the great bell hung from its wheel in the tower arch, swaying almost imperceptibly as it settled. Near the base of the narrow stone stair that wound upward within the wall, a figure lay at an impossible angle, one arm pinned beneath the body, one leg twisted as though its owner had tried desperately at the final moment to arrest his fall. Mr. Silas Blackwood's silver watch chain caught the candlelight, and his usually florid face had taken on the terrible pallor of the recently dead. His walking stick lay several feet away, as though it had been flung from his grasp. "There," said Dr. Pike, very gently, after the briefest of examinations. "No more church business for Silas." Miss Marple remained where she was, out of the way but observant, her mind attending to details with the automatic precision of long practice. The bell rope had been secured to its cleat with a knot that seemed remarkably neat for someone who had supposedly fallen to his death moments later. A fine trail of what appeared to be flour or powder traced along the edge of the lowest step. Near Mr. Blackwood's outstretched hand lay a small spray of Michaelmas daisies, their purple faces crushed to darkness, flowers that had no business in a church at midnight. On the nearest pew seat rested a woman's glove, left hand, pale kid leather, turned back as though its owner had removed it hastily. Beneath the pew, almost invisible against the worn stone, something glinted when the candlelight wavered. A small button, mother of pearl by its appearance, with a distinct chip along one edge. "Miss Marple," Dr. Pike said softly, noting her stillness. "Perhaps you shouldn't—" "I am precisely where I ought to be," she replied with her customary mildness. "At my age, one develops a certain familiarity with churches and their mysteries." Inspector Cray arrived within the quarter hour, his hat in his hand, and his expression suggesting a man who had hoped his evening's rest would remain undisturbed. He surveyed the scene with the weary competence of someone who had learned that villages, for all their apparent tranquility, could produce the most perplexing situations. "Right then," he said, crouching beside the body and examining the stone steps with careful attention. "Looks like a fall, but I'll want the pathologist's opinion before we draw conclusions." His gaze moved to the bell rope, to the scattered flowers, and finally to Miss Marple's composed face. "You're thinking something, Miss Marple." "I was merely recalling," she said thoughtfully, "that my dear nephew Raymond once told me about a case where the most important evidence was not what was present, but what was conspicuously absent. It does make one wonder, doesn't it, about the curious timing of that bell, and why a man of Mr. Blackwood's careful habits would venture into a bell tower after midnight." As the authorities took charge of the scene and statements were gathered from the assembled villagers, Miss Marple noticed several things that others seemed to overlook. Mrs. Pember's composed demeanor despite the shocking discovery. The faint scent of lavender that lingered near the altar, and the way certain members of the crowd avoided looking directly at the body, as though they had expected to find exactly what they had found. The great bell of St. Aldhelm's had rung after midnight, and with its tolling, the peaceful village had awakened to find that some secrets, like some bells, cannot remain silent forever. By dawn, the church bells remained silent, but the village had awakened to a different kind of tolling, the relentless chiming of speculation that passed from cottage to cottage with the morning milk delivery. Inspector Cray had sealed St. Aldhelm's with yellow tape and stationed P.C. Reed at the lich gate, transforming the familiar sanctuary into something foreign and forbidding. The sight of the constable's earnest figure pacing before the ancient stones served as a constant reminder that their peaceful world had been violently altered. Miss Marple, who had risen at her customary hour despite the previous evening's disturbances, found herself the recipient of numerous callers whose concern for her well-being barely concealed their hunger for details. Mrs. Henderson arrived first, bearing a pot of tea in the slightly breathless manner of someone who had hurried through her morning routine. "Such a shock for you, dear Miss Marple," she said, settling into the chintz armchair with the air of someone prepared for lengthy discussion. "Finding poor Mr. Blackwood like that, though I must say it does make one wonder what he was doing in the church at such an hour." Her hands trembled slightly as she accepted her teacup, and Miss Marple noted how her eyes kept darting toward the church steeple visible through the window. "Most peculiar timing indeed," Miss Marple replied mildly, her knitting needles maintaining their gentle rhythm. "Though you know how particular he was about church matters." "Well, yes, but between you and me, Silas had been acting rather strangely these past few weeks. Distracted during services, asking Mrs. Bostock odd questions about church records and previous incumbents. Ancient history, really." Before Miss Marple could respond, Colonel Melbury appeared at the garden gate, his morning constitutional having taken a decidedly investigative turn. His wife followed, carrying a covered dish that proclaimed her practical response to crisis. "Terrible business," the colonel announced, settling his considerable frame onto the garden bench. "Can't make head nor tail of it. Blackwood was always sure-footed, knew every stone of that church." Mrs. Melbury arranged herself with military precision. "The inspector was asking about last evening's festivities. I told him that Silas seemed perfectly normal, though perhaps more animated than usual. He spent considerable time in conversation with Mrs. Pember near the end of the evening. Quite intense discussion, from what I observed." Speaking of Mrs. Pember, Mrs. Henderson leaned forward conspiratorially. "Did you notice how composed she was last night? Finding a body would give most people quite a turn, but she seemed almost prepared for it." Now, Colonel Melbury interjected with automatic gallantry. "Mustn't read too much into people's reactions. The woman's had a difficult time. Lost her husband not 6 months ago, heart attack, though there was some talk about irregularities with his business affairs." The conversation was interrupted by young Dr. Pike, whose usually cheerful countenance bore the weight of professional responsibility. He accepted Mrs. Melbury's offer of tea gratefully. "I've just come from the church," he said. "Inspector Cray wanted my preliminary observations before the pathologist arrives. Poor Blackwood appears to have struck his head during the fall, but there are peculiarities that warrant examination." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with polite interest. "Peculiarities?" Dr. Pike glanced around the group, weighing discretion against curiosity. "The position suggests he fell backward, but the injuries are difficult to reconcile with a simple stumble, and his hands were clean as if he'd just washed them despite supposedly handling bell ropes. One would expect some evidence of rough hemp." "How observant of you, Doctor," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "I don't suppose you noticed whether Mr. Blackwood was wearing his usual cologne? He was rather particular about such things." "Funny you should mention that. No trace of his usual bay rum, but I detected something floral. Lavender, perhaps. Quite strong, actually." Meanwhile, at the post office, Theories multiplied like spring flowers. Mrs. Bostock held court by the knitting patterns, declaring firmly, "Accident? Nonsense. Someone wanted him out of the way. Silas knew everyone's business, and not always kindly." Her gaze swept meaningfully toward Mrs. Pember, who was examining postcards with elegant detachment. Mr. Lionel Quayle, polishing his spectacles, offered his own theory. A man of Mr. Blackwood's wealth always makes enemies. Business dealings, inheritance matters. He seemed already appraising the deceased's estate. Miss Marple bought her usual digestive biscuits and listened with quiet attentiveness. She noted Mrs. Henderson's trembling hands, Mrs. Pember's practiced composure, and the way each villager projected their own understanding of human nature onto the grim tableau. The missing chalk bag, the crushed Michaelmas daisies, the kid glove, these details remained absent from their lively theories. As the morning progressed, the village rang with speculation, each voice adding its own note to a discordant symphony of suspicion. The bell had tolled once. Now St. Aldhelm in the Weald tolled back with human voices, each carrying its own version of truth. By mid-morning, Inspector Cray had established himself in the parish hall with the methodical efficiency of a man accustomed to untangling village complications. The pathologist's preliminary report lay before him, its clinical language at odds with the cheerful autumn decorations still adorning the walls from the previous evening's festivities. Dr. Hartwell's findings were precise. Mr. Blackwood had indeed died from the head injury sustained in his fall, but the angle suggested he had fallen backward rather than forward, unusual for someone descending narrow stone steps in darkness. Miss Marple arrived bearing a plate of her famous seed cake, ostensibly for the hard-working constabulary, but primarily to satisfy her own quiet curiosity about the investigation's progress. Inspector Cray, who had learned to value her insights during previous village difficulties, welcomed both the refreshment and her company. "Most peculiar circumstances, Inspector," she observed, settling into a chair with her knitting bag. "I've been thinking about poor Mr. Blackwood's condition when we found him. His hands were remarkably clean for someone who had supposedly been pulling bell ropes. Hemp leaves such distinctive marks, as any sailor could attest." "Indeed, Miss Marple, Dr. Hartwell noted the same thing. No rope burns, no hemp fibers under the fingernails." Inspector Cray consulted his notes. "More curious still, we've discovered that Mr. Blackwood's church key is missing. The vicar confirms it wasn't among his effects, and it hasn't been found anywhere in the church." "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured, her needles maintaining their gentle rhythm. Keys have such a way of disappearing when someone wishes to explain access they cannot otherwise account for. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Henderson, who appeared at the door with the breathless urgency of someone bearing important news. Her usual composed demeanor had given way to barely contained agitation. "Inspector, I felt I should mention, yesterday evening after we'd finished clearing the hall, I saw someone near the church. It was quite late, past 11, and I was closing my bedroom curtains when I noticed a figure by the side door. Too dark to see clearly, but they seemed to be fumbling with the lock." Inspector Cray leaned forward with interest. "Male or female?" "I couldn't say for certain, but the person was wearing something pale, a coat or shawl perhaps, and there was a faint scent on the evening air. Lavender, quite distinct." Mrs. Henderson twisted her handkerchief anxiously. "I thought nothing of it at the time, assumed it was Mr. Blackwood checking that everything was secure." After Mrs. Henderson departed, Miss Marple remarked thoughtfully, "Lavender is such a distinctive fragrance. I noticed it quite strongly near the altar last night, though it seemed oddly out of place in a church that typically smells of beeswax and old prayer books." The morning brought a steady stream of visitors, each adding their own thread to the increasingly complex tapestry of village speculation. Colonel Melbury confirmed that the bell rope had been properly secured with a cleat hitch, not the hasty work of someone in distress, but the careful knot of someone familiar with such things. Mrs. Bostock, magnificent in her indignation, reported that the ringer's chalk bag was missing from its usual place by the bell stairs, though she couldn't say precisely when it had disappeared. 30 years I've been managing those bell ringers, she declared, and they've always kept their chalk properly stored. Someone took that bag, mark my words, and for no good purpose. Most intriguing was young Dr. Pike's observation that Mr. Blackwood had smelled strongly of lavender when they found him, despite his usual preference for bay rum cologne. Quite overpowering, actually, the doctor confided, as though someone had doused him with the stuff. As the pieces of information accumulated, Miss Marple found herself thinking of her dear nephew Raymond's observation about mysteries, that the most important clues were often those that seemed least significant. A missing key, clean hands, the scent of lavender, crushed flowers that should have finished blooming weeks ago, each detail whispered of careful planning rather than sudden violence. The village, meanwhile, had begun to focus its collective suspicion on Mrs. Pember, whose recent arrival and elegant composure struck many as suspicious in itself. But Miss Marple, watching the subtle interplay of glances and carefully chosen words, suspected that the truth lay deeper than surface appearances suggested. The following morning brought Inspector Cray back to St. Aldhelm's with renewed purpose, accompanied by the police photographer and a determination to examine every detail that might have been overlooked in the previous night's confusion. Miss Marple, arriving with a thermos of tea for the hard-working constabulary, found herself once again in the position of helpful observer as the investigation proceeded with methodical thoroughness. The church, in daylight filtered through ancient stained glass, revealed details that candlelight had obscured. Inspector Cray knelt beside the tower stairs, examining with particular attention the faint trail of white powder that Miss Marple had first noticed. Dr. Pike's magnifying glass confirmed what her experienced fingers had already determined. Not chalk, as one might expect from bell ringers, the inspector observed, carefully collecting samples. Too fine, too smooth. This is whiting, the sort used for polishing silver to a high shine. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her gaze moving to the fresh scratch on the nearby pew rail where someone had caught a button in hasty movement. How very interesting that Mr. Quayle should have had traces of such powder on his fingers yesterday. Professional necessity, of course, but one does wonder about the timing. Their examination was interrupted by young Alfie Briggs, who had been lingering hopefully near the lich gate in the manner of boys who sense important events unfolding. P.C. Reed, recognizing the lad's potential value as a witness, brought him forward with gentle encouragement. "Tell the inspector what you told me about last night, Alfie," Reed prompted. The boy, round-eyed with the importance of his testimony, reported that he had indeed seen Mr. Quayle near the church around 11:30, carrying what appeared to be a brown paper parcel tied with string. "I was coming back from the Black Badger with Da's message to Mr. Henley," he explained earnestly. "Mr. Quayle was by the side door, fumbling with something. Dropped his parcel once, he did, and I heard glass clinking inside." Inspector Cray made careful notes, while Miss Marple observed that glass and silver polish suggested someone preparing valuable items for transport or concealment. The boy's testimony, while not conclusive, added another thread to the increasingly complex tapestry of that midnight hour. Reverend Perry, summoned to provide access to the church records, arrived with the distracted air of a man whose peaceful world had been thoroughly disrupted. His revelation proved illuminating in ways that cast the previous evening's events in an entirely different light. Poor Silas had become quite obsessed with historical discrepancies, the vicar confided, producing ledgers whose pages bore the accumulated dust of centuries. He was convinced that valuable items mentioned in Victorian inventories had never been properly accounted for. A silver gilt chalice, several pieces of ecclesiastical plate, even references to what the old records call portable treasures secured against times of trouble. Miss Marple examined the faded entries with particular interest, noting references to items placed in the keeping of the night bell's guardian and secured where vigilance ensures protection. The language was deliberately obscure, but it spoke clearly of valuables hidden within the church structure itself. Mr. Blackwood consulted Mr. Quayle about the potential value of such pieces. Reverend Perry continued. He brought photocopies of the inventories just last week, seeking professional assessment. Quayle seemed quite interested, perhaps too interested in retrospect. The morning's discoveries painted a picture far more complex than Inspector Cray's initial theory about Mrs. Pember. While the lavender scent and pale glove remained puzzling elements, the evidence increasingly pointed towards someone with intimate knowledge of both church history and the commercial value of ecclesiastical treasures. Mr. Quayle's presence near the church, his professional expertise, and the physical evidence of his activities created a compelling alternative narrative. Miss Marple, examining the bell, rope with careful attention, noted again the expert seamanship of the knot securing it to its cleat. Such precise work, she observed mildly. The sort one learns through practice, not panic. I wonder if Mr. Quayle has nautical experience. Many antiques dealers develop such skills for securing valuable cargo. Inspector Cray's investigation of the vestry door revealed additional evidence of careful preparation rather than spontaneous violence. The lock showed signs of having been oiled recently, and the faint scent of lavender lingered on the metal fittings, applied, Miss Marple suspected, to mask other odors, or to create a deliberate trail of evidence pointing elsewhere. As they prepared to leave the church, Miss Marple paused beside the memorial tablets that lined the walls, her attention caught by one particular inscription. "Here lies Sir Aldhelm Pemberton," she read aloud, "benefactor of this parish, whose generous bequest ensures the eternal protection of God's treasures." The date was 1847, and the carved arms showed a distinctive chalice surrounded by bells. The Pemberton bequest, Reverend Perry confirmed. Silas was particularly interested in that one. The original chalice was supposed to be of exceptional craftsmanship and historical significance. He was convinced it had never left the church, despite various claims that it had been sold during financial difficulties. Walking back through the village, Inspector Cray felt the satisfaction of a case beginning to resolve itself into comprehensible patterns. The evidence against Mr. Quayle was circumstantial but compelling. His presence near the church, his professional interest in valuable ecclesiastical items, the physical traces connecting him to the scene. Mrs. Pember's role appeared to be that of an innocent newcomer whose arrival had coincidentally triggered Mr. Blackwood's fatal investigation. However, Miss Marple found herself thinking of her dear nephew Raymond's observation that in the most puzzling cases, the solution often lay not in the evidence that pointed most obviously toward guilt, but in the small inconsistencies that revealed a more subtle truth. The clean hands remained the most troubling detail. Someone had taken considerable care to remove evidence from the deceased, suggesting a level of calculation that spoke of long-term planning rather than spontaneous violence. As the church bell tower cast its shadow across the village green, Miss Marple reflected that whoever had rung that bell after midnight had done so with purpose beyond mere mischief. The truth, she suspected, lay somewhere in the intersection of ancient treasures, modern greed, and the eternal human capacity for deception wrapped in the most innocent of appearances. That afternoon brought Inspector Cray to Mr. Quayle's antiques shop with a search warrant and a growing sense that the investigation was finally approaching clarity. The proprietor received them with his customary professional demeanor, though Miss Marple, who had positioned herself across the village green with her afternoon knitting, noted the slight tremor in his hands as he polished a silver tea service with unnecessary vigor. The search revealed several items that corresponded remarkably well to descriptions in the church inventories, though Quayle's explanations remained plausible. More significantly, Inspector Cray discovered photocopied church records, the same documents Mr. Blackwood had consulted, along with detailed sketches of the church interior marked with potential hiding places. A small vial of lavender oil sat prominently on the workbench, nearly empty, beside cloths heavy with silver polish. "Mr. Blackwood contacted me yesterday afternoon," Quayle explained with careful composure. Quite excited about his discovery of the Pemberton bequest references, he insisted I meet him at the church after the festivities to assess potential fines before involving the church council. A man of his business acumen understood the importance of proper valuation. Inspector Cray made methodical notes while observing that Quayle's chipped mother-of-pearl button matched the fragment found beneath the church pew. The antiques dealer's explanation that he had caught it while retrieving dropped polishing compounds seemed reasonable enough, yet something in his manner suggested rehearsed justification rather than spontaneous recollection. I arrived shortly before midnight, Quayle continued. Silas was already there, quite animated, examining an old recess near the altar. We discussed the historical significance of various architectural features when I accidentally dropped my case of specialized polishing preparations. The whiting you found came from that mishap. As for leaving, well, the whole affair struck me as irregular. When he mentioned searching the bell tower, I decided discretion was preferable to involvement in what might prove embarrassing to the parish. Miss Marple, entering the shop ostensibly to inquire about a porcelain shepherdess, observed Quayle's performance with the attention she typically reserved for particularly interesting specimens of human nature. His account possessed the smooth coherence of someone who had anticipated such questions, yet small details troubled her methodical mind. The lavender oil, for instance, seemed oddly prominent for someone whose professional concerns centered on silver polish and furniture wax. The afternoon's developments took an unexpected turn when Dr. Pike arrived with disturbing news from his continued examination of the scene. Armed with better lighting equipment and a more thorough understanding of the circumstances, he had discovered details that transformed the investigation's entire foundation. The head wound remains consistent with a fall, he reported gravely, but there are additional marks I initially overlooked. Small bruises on the upper arms, defensive scratches on the hands despite their having been cleaned afterward. Someone struggled with Mr. Blackwood before he fell. This wasn't an accident. It was murder disguised to appear otherwise. This revelation cast the carefully arranged evidence in an entirely different light. The clean hands, the positioned flowers, the scented chalk bag, and the conveniently placed clues all suggested not panic-driven concealment, but methodical misdirection by someone determined to obscure the true circumstances while providing investigators with multiple theories to pursue. Inspector Cray's growing satisfaction with his case against Quayle was further complicated by Mrs. Henderson's unexpected appearance at the parish hall. The usually composed woman arrived in considerable distress, her habitual reserve replaced by barely controlled agitation. "I haven't been entirely truthful about what I observed," she confessed, wringing her handkerchief with nervous energy. "When I saw that figure by the church door, there was something familiar about the movement, the particular way they held themselves. I didn't want to believe it, but I'm certain now. It was someone I know well, someone whose presence there would never normally arouse suspicion." Her revelation, however, pointed neither toward Mrs. Pember nor Mr. Quayle, but toward Mrs. Bostock, whose 30 years of managing parish affairs had given her unparalleled access to church keys and intimate knowledge of every architectural detail. The formidable church warden's distinctive gait, favoring her left side since a winter fall, had been unmistakable in the moonlight. Miss Marple listened to these developments with the quiet attention of someone assembling a complex puzzle. 3 suspects, each with compelling evidence, yet each piece of evidence somehow too convenient, too perfectly arranged. It reminded her of her nephew Raymond's observation about the most dangerous deceptions, those that provided investigators with exactly what they expected to find, while the truth remained safely hidden beneath layers of misdirection. As evening approached, she reflected that whoever had rung that bell after midnight had orchestrated events with considerable sophistication, understanding that the most effective concealment often lay not in hiding evidence, but in ensuring it pointed in carefully chosen directions. The morning brought Inspector Cray to Mrs. Bostock's tidy cottage behind the village school. where he found the formidable churchwarden deadheading her roses with the methodical precision that characterized all her endeavors. Her reception of his questions displayed the same uncompromising directness that had governed her parish management for 30 years, though Miss Marple, who had accompanied the inspector ostensibly to return a borrowed prayer book, noted subtle signs of strain beneath the woman's customary authority. "Certainly, I was at the church after the festivities," Mrs. Bostock declared, her secateurs clicking with decisive finality. Someone had to ensure everything was properly secured. 30 years of managing parish affairs teaches one that responsibility cannot be delegated to wishful thinking. She paused, fixing Inspector Cray with a steady gaze. "I use carbolic soap, Inspector. Always have, always will. It kills germs and idle gossip with equal efficiency. If you're detecting lavender, you're detecting someone else entirely." Her explanation possessed the ring of established routine, yet certain revelations transformed the investigation's understanding of that fateful evening. Mrs. Bostock confirmed that she had indeed encountered Mr. Blackwood in the church around 11 o'clock, examining the area behind the Pemberton Memorial with considerable excitement. Silas had discovered references to treasures secured where vigilance ensures protection, she explained, her tone suggesting disapproval of such irregular proceedings. He was convinced they referred to hiding places within the church structure itself. I told him such searches required proper authorization, but he was quite insistent about examining the bell tower immediately. Said he suspected someone else was already aware of his discoveries and might act first if he delayed. Most significantly, Mrs. Bostock revealed that Mr. Blackwood had borrowed the old tower key on Wednesday for his historical research, and had never returned it. "If you haven't found it on him," she observed with characteristic practicality, "then someone else has it now." This information sent P.C. Reed on a more thorough search of the village, which yielded discoveries that seemed to resolve the case with startling clarity. In Mrs. Pember's elegant cottage, carefully tucked within an ornate writing desk, he found the matching pale kid glove, a right hand, to complement the left one discovered beneath the church pew. Beside it sat a half-empty bottle of expensive lavender perfume, its scent identical to the overwhelming fragrance Dr. Pike had detected on the deceased. Inspector Cray received this news with grim satisfaction. "There's our evidence," he declared, examining the items with professional thoroughness. "The gloves, the lavender scent, her presence at the church, it all points to Mrs. Pember. Blackwood confronted her about her husband's dealings. There was a struggle, and she attempted to cover her tracks with misdirection." The inspector's theory spread through the village with the swift efficiency of all compelling explanations. Mrs. Pember, with her London origins and elegant detachment, had always remained slightly apart from village life, making her guilt more palatable than suspecting one of their own. The physical evidence seemed overwhelming, the motive clear, and the case appeared destined for a swift resolution. However, Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by the very completeness of the evidence against Mrs. Pember. The matching glove discovered so conveniently, the lavender perfume placed almost prominently in the desk, the overwhelming scent that Dr. Pike had described as though someone had doused Mr. Blackwood with the fragrance. It all struck her as remarkably accommodating for a panicked murderer attempting concealment. Her unease deepened when Mrs. Pember requested a private meeting, her usual composure finally cracking under the weight of mounting suspicion. "I must tell you about my conversation with Mr. Blackwood," she confessed, her elegant facade replaced by evident distress. "He wasn't merely interested in church history. He was convinced that my late husband had acquired items that rightfully belonged to St. Aldhelm's. Charles dealt in ecclesiastical antiquities, and Silas had somehow obtained evidence suggesting irregular transactions involving this parish. This revelation transformed the entire context of Mr. Blackwood's midnight activities. If he had been pursuing not hidden treasures, but stolen ones, his urgent search represented an attempt at recovery rather than discovery. The implications shifted accordingly, as did the potential motives for silencing his investigation permanently. As Miss Marple walked home through the gathering dusk, she reflected on the sophisticated nature of the deception they were witnessing. 3 compelling suspects, each with credible evidence and plausible motives. Yet the very perfection of the case against Mrs. Pember suggested something more calculated than desperate concealment. The crushed Michaelmas daisies, the expertly tied bell rope, the strategically placed clues, all spoke of someone who understood not merely how to commit murder, but how to manipulate the subsequent investigation. The bell that had rung after midnight, she now suspected, had served not as an alarm but as misdirection, drawing attention to the church while the real work of evidence placement occurred elsewhere. Someone had orchestrated these events with remarkable psychological insight, understanding that investigators would eagerly embrace the most convenient explanation, while the truth remained safely hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed deception. The killer, Miss Marple realized with growing certainty, was still walking freely among them, watching with satisfaction as suspicion focused exactly where it had been designed to fall. That evening brought Miss Marple back to the church with Inspector Cray, her gentle insistence having convinced him that certain details warranted closer examination under more controlled circumstances. The ancient building held its shadows differently in the deliberate quiet of their investigation, and Miss Marple moved through the nave with the purposeful attention of someone who had learned to read the stories that objects told when human voices fell silent. At the base of the bell tower, she knelt beside the rope cleat with her magnifying glass, examining what daylight had rendered nearly invisible. A faint residue darkened the wood grain where something had recently been applied. Not candle wax, but the soft dressing that sailors used to preserve cordage from fraying. Near the jamb of the side door, a tiny bright scratch in the stone showed where some small hook or staple had been driven into the mortar and recently removed, leaving powdery fragments that spoke of hasty concealment. "I've observed," Miss Marple murmured, tracing an almost invisible line with her finger, "that when my great-nephew wishes to be summoned for early morning adventures, he contrives an ingenious alarm by connecting string from his window to a tin tray balanced on the garden fence. Our midnight bell may have been persuaded to announce itself through similar mechanical assistance." Inspector Cray followed the delicate evidence of what appeared to be a cord running from the bell cleat toward the side door. Though the line itself had been removed, the marks of its recent presence whispered clearly to those who knew how to interpret such signs. They conducted a careful experiment with twine borrowed from the vestry, discovering that opening the side door could indeed draw the bell rope just enough to produce a single, hollow note that would carry clearly through the village night. The bell would toll the instant someone entered, Inspector Cray observed grimly, creating an alarm to draw witnesses while the real work proceeded elsewhere entirely. Their examination of the vestry revealed additional evidence of hasty activity. In a shallow basin lay a damp towel, bearing the faint scent of lavender overlaying the sharper bite of carbolic soap. Beside it sat a sliver of hard soap scraped nearly to nothing, and the water in the ewer showed a thin, cloudy film that suggested recent use for washing something more substantial than hands. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the Pemberton Memorial, where her careful examination revealed hairline marks along the stone's edge, as though a concealed panel had been recently disturbed. A gentle pressure on a carved rosette yielded a narrow cavity, empty now, but clearly not long unvisited. Dust patterns suggested a wrapped object had been removed with considerable care, and in one corner lay traces of the fine whiting they had found throughout the church, along with a crushed fragment of purple that could only have come from a Michaelmas daisy. The following morning brought Miss Marple to Mrs. Henderson's cottage, ostensibly to admire the late-blooming flowers that provided such cheerful color against the autumn landscape. Mrs. Henderson, still somewhat unsettled by the previous day's revelations, welcomed her visitor with nervous eagerness, though her usual composed demeanor showed signs of strain. "Such beautiful Michaelmas daisies," Miss Marple observed, examining the vibrant purple blooms with apparent innocence. "I noticed some crushed ones near poor Mr. Blackwood. So unusual to find fresh flowers at this season, particularly in a church at midnight. One does wonder about their origin. Mrs. Henderson's careful composure faltered visibly. Her eyes darted toward the church steeple before returning to Miss Marple's face, and her hands began the nervous plucking at dead leaves that betrayed deeper anxiety than social discomfort. "Oh dear me, yes. Anyone might have had them, I suppose. They're quite common in cottage gardens." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed mildly, "though to be crushed near a body suggests they were held during some sort of struggle, doesn't it? Perhaps by someone who had picked them earlier in the evening, intending them for decoration, and then found themselves in circumstances they hadn't anticipated." The conversation continued with Miss Marple's characteristic gentleness, each seemingly innocent observation adding subtle pressure to Mrs. Henderson's increasingly fragile composure. When Miss Marple mentioned the expertly tied bell rope and the curious cleanliness of Mr. Blackwood's hands, Mrs. Henderson's response revealed knowledge she should not have possessed. "My late husband was quite skilled with nautical knots," she said without thinking, then caught herself with visible alarm. "Not that I paid much attention to such things, of course." Miss Marple noted how Mrs. Henderson's teacup rattled against its saucer, and how her gaze kept returning to the church tower as though drawn by some terrible fascination. The woman who had been so helpful in providing testimony about mysterious figures and lavender scents was revealing herself to possess far more intimate knowledge of that midnight hour than any innocent witness should command. As Miss Marple walked home through the village, she reflected on the sophisticated nature of the deception they were witnessing. Someone had orchestrated events with remarkable psychological insight, understanding that investigators would eagerly embrace convenient explanations, while the truth remained safely hidden beneath layers of careful misdirection. The mechanical bell device, the planted evidence, the strategic placement of witnesses and testimony, all spoke of a mind that understood not merely how to commit murder, but how to manipulate the subsequent investigation with surgical precision. The killer was indeed still walking freely among them, but Miss Marple now felt certain she knew who had rung that bell after midnight, and why the truth had been so artfully concealed beneath layers of misdirection that pointed accusingly toward everyone except the one person who possessed both the knowledge and the opportunity to orchestrate such an elaborate deception. That evening brought Miss Marple back to the church with Inspector Cray, her gentle insistence having convinced him that certain details warranted examination under more controlled circumstances. Armed with proper lighting and measuring tools, they conducted a methodical investigation that revealed the sophisticated nature of the deception they were confronting. At the base of the bell tower, Miss Marple's magnifying glass revealed what daylight had rendered nearly invisible. Fine scratches in the stone jamb showed where a small eyelet had been recently installed and removed, leaving fresh powder in the mortar. The bell rope itself bore traces of marine-grade dressing, not the rough hemp one would expect, but the carefully maintained cordage of someone familiar with nautical practices. "I have observed," Miss Marple murmured, tracing an almost invisible groove with her finger, "that when my great-nephew wishes to create an early morning alarm, he contrives an ingenious device connecting string from his window to a balanced object in the garden. Our midnight bell may have been persuaded to announce itself through similar mechanical assistance." Their careful reconstruction revealed the elegant simplicity of the device. A fine cord, now removed, had run from the side door to the bell cleat. Opening the door would draw the rope just enough to produce a single resonant toll, creating an instant alarm while the perpetrator worked elsewhere entirely. The expertly tied knot securing the bell rope spoke of someone with considerable experience in seamanship, not the panicked fumbling of an accidental death. Inspector Cray examined the evidence with growing understanding. The bell wasn't rung by the victim at all. It was a deliberate signal, timed to draw witnesses at precisely the right moment. The following afternoon, Miss Marple arranged to meet Mrs. Henderson in the parish hall under the pretext of organizing memorial flowers for Mr. Blackwood's funeral. She positioned herself at a table laden with autumn chrysanthemums, their bronze and gold faces providing cheerful contrast to the gravity of their purpose. Mrs. Henderson arrived with nervous punctuality, her usually steady hands betraying subtle tremors as she removed her gloves. The same pale kid leather that had featured so prominently in the investigation, though these showed no signs of recent church adventures. Her movements carried the careful precision of someone concentrating intensely on appearing natural. "Such a terrible business," Mrs. Henderson murmured, accepting the flowers Miss Marple offered. "Poor Silas, falling like that, though I suppose at his age one's balance isn't what it used to be." Miss Marple observed how Mrs. Henderson's fingers worked among the flower stems with unconscious expertise, not the hesitant efforts of an occasional volunteer, but the practiced efficiency of someone who had arranged church flowers many times before. More tellingly, when Miss Marple handed her twine to secure a bundle, Mrs. Henderson automatically tied it with a perfect cleat hitch before catching herself and hastily cutting the string. "Dr. Pike mentioned those curious clean hands," Miss Marple observed mildly, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm. "One does wonder what poor Mr. Blackwood had been handling that required such thorough washing. Afterward—" Mrs. Henderson's composure cracked almost imperceptibly. "Clean hands? How very odd. Though I suppose if he'd been examining old documents, he might have wanted to wash off the dust." Miss Marple continued her gentle probing, each observation delivered with the mild curiosity of casual conversation rather than interrogation. She mentioned the mechanical arrangement that had triggered the bell, the expert knotwork, and the curious timing that had brought witnesses to the scene at precisely the right moment. "You seem remarkably well informed about the circumstances," Miss Marple observed, "almost as though you had witnessed events yourself rather than hearing about them second-hand. And those beautiful Michaelmas daisies we found, so fresh for the season. I noticed you have some particularly fine ones in your garden." With each detail, Mrs. Henderson's responses revealed knowledge she shouldn't have possessed and explanations that came too readily to mind. Her hands trembled as she worked among the flowers, and Miss Marple noted how she avoided direct eye contact, her gaze repeatedly darting toward the church steeple visible through the window. "Your late husband was quite skilled with nautical knots, wasn't he?" Miss Marple continued conversationally. "Such useful knowledge. I imagine you learned a great deal from watching him work with ropes and cordage over the years." Mrs. Henderson's face had gone pale, her fingers stilling among the chrysanthemum stems. The careful composure she had maintained for days was finally beginning to crack under the weight of Miss Marple's relentless gentleness. "I don't know what you're implying," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I am merely observing," Miss Marple replied with characteristic mildness, "that someone with intimate knowledge of both church procedures and nautical techniques would be uniquely positioned to orchestrate the events we witnessed. Someone who could move through the church without suspicion, who understood exactly how to create the mechanical device that rang the bell, and who possessed the expertise to wash away evidence while planting misleading clues." The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the gentle clicking of Miss Marple's knitting needles. Mrs. Henderson's breathing had become shallow and rapid, her carefully constructed facade crumbling to reveal the desperate fear beneath. The woman who had been so helpful in providing testimony about mysterious figures and lavender scents was revealing herself to possess far more intimate knowledge of that midnight hour than any innocent witness should command. As Inspector Cray arrived at Miss Marple's quiet summons, the truth hung in the air like incense, heavy with the weight of revelation. The bell that had rung after midnight had indeed announced a death, though not in the way its creator had intended. Mrs. Henderson sat among her scattered flowers, no longer able to maintain the pretense that had sustained her through days of careful deception. The final revelation awaited, but Miss Marple knew that the most dangerous moment in any investigation came not when guilt was suspected, but when it was about to be proven beyond all doubt. Inspector Cray arrived at the vicarage that evening with the measured tread of a man who had learned to recognize when investigation transformed into revelation. Miss Marple had suggested, with her characteristic gentle insistence, that the arrangements for Mr. Blackwood's funeral required discussion among those most concerned with parish affairs. The gathering appeared perfectly innocent. Reverend Parry with his papers and mild efficiency, Mrs. Bostock managing seating arrangements with military precision, Mr. Quayle admiring ecclesiastical furnishings with professional interest, Mrs. Pember asking quiet questions about appropriate hymns, and Mrs. Henderson arriving with homemade biscuits and a brittleness of manner that sat oddly upon her usual composure. Miss Marple positioned herself by the hearth with her knitting, observing the subtle interplay of personalities with the attention she typically reserved for the most interesting specimens of human nature. When Mrs. Bostock declared that someone should bind posies for the funeral arrangements, Miss Marple offered a ball of fine twine with apologetic mildness. "Such thin cord," she murmured. "I do hope it will suffice for the purpose." The responses proved illuminating beyond their practical function. Mr. Quayle tied a loose bow that revealed careful hands unschooled in maritime practices. Mrs. Bostock produced a square knot with the firm practicality of someone accustomed to securing things properly. Reverend Parry made an endearing muddle and laughed at his own incompetence. Mrs. Pember, after brief hesitation, managed a simple loop with ladylike efficiency. Mrs. Henderson, however, without looking up from her task, produced a perfect cleat hitch around the twine reel and cut the end with swift, practiced precision. The silence that followed carried weight beyond its duration. Inspector Cray, who had been studying the fire, now focused his attention entirely on the twine and its revealing knots. "About the flowers for poor Mr. Blackwood," Miss Marple continued in her wandering fashion. "Michaelmas daisies maintain their color so beautifully, don't they? Though they bruise easily when crushed, and the purple stains one's fingertips quite distinctively. I noticed a petal lodged in the church dust behind the Pemberton Memorial. Such an unusual location for a garden flower." Mrs. Henderson's teacup rattled against its saucer with audible distress. She set it down with exaggerated care and offered more biscuits with forced cheerfulness, though no one accepted. Outside, autumn wind moved through the vicarage yews with the ancient whisper that had accompanied other revelations in other troubled evenings. Miss Marple excused herself briefly, returning with a small smile and a nod to Inspector Cray. Moments later, the vicar's side door opened, and a single, solemn bell note rolled through the house from the dark church across the green. The sound was not loud. It required no volume to achieve its purpose. Mr. Quayle started and smiled nervously at his own reaction. Mrs. Bostock frowned with disapproval. Mrs. Pember gripped her chair arms and went visibly pale. Mrs. Henderson half rose, her eyes darting not toward the front door as the others did, but toward the small passage leading to the vestry gate, before catching herself and sitting rigidly still with fingers laced too tightly together. "How remarkable," Miss Marple observed with mild curiosity. "Such an obedient bell, responding when a door opens, almost as though it had been trained to do so." The Reverend apologized for drafts, while Inspector Cray maintained meaningful silence. "I've observed," Miss Marple continued in her gentle voice that made people forget its capacity for cutting truth, "that when individuals accomplish something cleverly, they develop expectations about how the world should respond to their contrivances. There is comfort in being answered by one's own devices. Sometimes, however, echoes occur that the Creator never anticipated." Mrs. Henderson's voice carried sharp edges when she replied, "I don't understand your implications," before softening with visible effort. "That is, I find myself confused by this discussion of mechanisms and bells. Surely if the church door is insecure, it should be properly attended to immediately." "It has been secured," Inspector Cray stated quietly. "We attended to it this afternoon." Silence settled over the gathering like incense, heavy with unspoken knowledge. Miss Marple smiled down at the vicar's cat, who had chosen her ankles as sanctuary and appeared to recall something pleasant. I once had an aunt who never ventured anywhere without lavender at her throat. When she wished to disguise the carbolic scent on her hands after thorough scrubbing, she applied lavender with unfortunate excess. The fragrance clings, you understand, to towels and basins and metal surfaces, even after fingers are scrubbed quite pink. That presents the difficulty with cleaning away truth. One inevitably leaves behind the story of one's cleaning efforts. Mrs. Henderson's breath caught audibly. You cannot possibly mean, why, everyone uses lavender for various purposes. Not I, Mrs. Bostock declared with formidable pride. I employ nothing but carbolic and common sense. And I, Miss Marple said sweetly, rely upon memory. For instance, I recall you mentioning that you observed a figure by the side door, fumbling with the lock. You claimed unclear visibility, yet you knew the precise hour, the exact scent, and specifically the side entrance rather than the main door most people would assume. I wondered then how such certain knowledge comes to a person in darkness. The room held its collective breath. Mrs. Henderson's careful composure finally cracked completely, years of respectable pretense crumbling under the gentle but relentless pressure of Miss Marple's observations. It began so innocently, she whispered, her voice carrying the hollow quality of someone whose carefully constructed world was dissolving. After Harold died, his pension proved insufficient for the retirement we had planned. The church treasures had been neglected for decades, gathering dust in forgotten recesses. No one remembered most of them existed. A small silver pyx seemed harmless enough. It paid for Harold's final medical treatments when nothing else would suffice. The confession emerged in painful fragments, each revelation painting clearer pictures of desperation masked by decades of respectability. Over 15 years, Mrs. Henderson had systematically removed ecclesiastical treasures from their hiding places, replacing them with careful documentation suggesting legitimate sales during various financial crises. Her position, arranging church flowers, provided unquestioned access to every corner of the building, while her reputation for propriety ensured no one questioned her presence at unusual hours. Mr. Blackwood's research had identified discrepancies in the Victorian inventories, she continued, her hands now trembling violently among the scattered chrysanthemums. Items that should have remained in the church collection but had mysteriously vanished. He had traced several pieces to London auction houses, all sold by someone claiming parish authorization. He demanded I meet him at the church after the harvest festival to examine the hiding places he had discovered. The mechanical device that triggered the bell had indeed been her creation, designed to provide witnesses at precisely the moment they would discover Mr. Blackwood's body and assume accidental death. Harold's naval expertise had taught her the knots and cordage techniques necessary for such contrivances, while her intimate knowledge of village routines enabled her to predict exactly who would respond to midnight tolling. I never intended murder, Mrs. Henderson insisted, though her words carried little conviction even to herself. I hoped to convince him that missing items had been legitimately sold, that records were simply incomplete. But he possessed evidence, auction photographs, correspondence with dealers. He threatened immediate exposure of everything. The struggle in the bell tower had been brief but decisive. Confronted with proof of systematic theft, Mr. Blackwood had promised immediate disclosure to authorities. In desperate panic, she had pushed him during their heated argument, sending him backward down the narrow stone steps with fatal consequences. The washing, the planted evidence, the lavender misdirection, you had prepared for the possibility that persuasion might fail, Inspector Cray observed grimly. Mrs. Henderson nodded with weary acknowledgement. The elaborate deception pointing suspicion toward Mrs. Pember, Mr. Quayle, and Mrs. Bostock had been carefully orchestrated over months of preparation. She had studied each potential suspect, understanding their vulnerabilities and how evidence could be arranged to exploit them. I purchased the gloves specifically to implicate Mrs. Pember, she admitted. The lavender oil, the strategic testimony about mysterious figures. Everything was designed to create multiple compelling theories while obscuring truth. I believed if sufficient suspects existed with credible evidence, investigation would never focus long enough on any individual to discover actual circumstances. As Inspector Cray formally cautioned Mrs. Henderson and began procedures that would transform her from respected villager to accused criminal, Miss Marple reflected on the sophisticated deception they had witnessed. The bell that rang after midnight had indeed announced death, though not as its creator intended. Instead, it marked the beginning of an investigation that ultimately revealed not merely murder, but 15 years of systematic theft hidden beneath the most respectable appearances. The truth, as her dear nephew Raymond often observed, frequently proved more complex than evidence suggested. The most dangerous criminals were often those who understood precisely how to manipulate the human tendency to believe what seemed most obvious. The finality of Mrs. Henderson's confession settled over the vicarage drawing room like evening mist, transforming familiar faces into studies of shock and dawning comprehension. Inspector Cray guided the broken woman away with quiet efficiency, her resistance minimal, her spirit crushed beneath the weight of 15 hours of deception finally exposed. The comfortable illusions of their peaceful village lay shattered, revealing currents of desperation that had flowed undetected beneath their daily routines. Reverend Parry sank into his chair, face pale with disbelief. 15 years, he whispered. Such an upright member of our community, and we never suspected. Uprightness, Miss Marple observed gently, her knitting needles now still, can sometimes serve as the most effective disguise, Reverend. Mrs. Henderson understood that respectability provides perfect camouflage for activities that would otherwise attract immediate attention. Mrs. Bostock, her formidable composure finally cracked, shook her head slowly. The bell rope, the chalk bag. I should have recognized her handiwork. She was always so particular about checking the bells after our ringers finished. And the evidence against Mrs. Pember? The elegant widow asked quietly. Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. Carefully orchestrated misdirection, my dear. Mrs. Henderson observed your habits, noted your preference for lavender, and planted evidence accordingly. The matching glove, the perfume bottle positioned prominently in your desk, the overwhelming scent at the scene, all designed to create a compelling case against you while obscuring her own involvement. Mr. Quayle, recovering his professional composure, added, "The church treasures she showed me were genuine pieces, though I suspect now they represented only a fraction of what she had systematically removed over the years." 3 weeks later, St. Aldhelm in the Weald had begun the slow process of healing that follows violent disruption of familiar patterns. The church bells rang again for Sunday services, their bronze voices carrying restored innocence across autumn fields, though villagers still glanced toward the tower with uncomfortable memories. Miss Marple, walking home from morning worship, reflected on how communities absorbed such shocks and gradually returned to essential rhythms, never quite unchanged by what they had witnessed. The recovered ecclesiastical treasures, those that could be traced, had been returned to their proper places, though gaps remained where irreplaceable pieces had vanished forever into private collections. Mrs. Pember had quietly departed for London, her cottage managed now by agents who understood nothing of village dynamics. Her elegant detachment, once interpreted as suspicious composure, now seemed the natural response of someone who had learned not to invest too heavily in communities that might turn against her without warning. Dr. Pike, sharing afternoon tea with Miss Marple, reflected on the case's psychological complexities. What strikes me most is how thoroughly she understood human nature. Every piece of planted evidence was designed to exploit our natural tendency to believe obvious explanations. Indeed, Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. I've observed that individuals who live double lives often develop remarkable skills in reading others. Mrs. Henderson spent years studying how people responded to her carefully constructed persona, knowledge she ultimately used to manipulate the investigation itself. Young Alfie Briggs appeared with a message from his mother and irrepressible curiosity about future mysteries. "Will there be more excitement, Miss Marple?" "My dear boy," she replied with gentle amusement, "the most interesting mysteries are often hidden in plain sight, disguised as perfectly ordinary behavior. The art lies in noticing when familiar patterns carry unfamiliar meanings." As evening settled over the village, Miss Marple walked once more past the church, where moonlight painted ancient stones with silver benediction. The great bell hung silent in its tower, waiting for proper occasions to announce the measured passage of community life. The mechanical device that had corrupted its midnight voice had been removed, leaving only memories of how easily trust could be betrayed by those who understood its mechanisms too well. The case had reminded her that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most respectable, who exploited the very virtues, trust, community spirit, charitable interpretation, that made civilized life possible. Yet truth possessed its own relentless logic. However carefully constructed, deceptions eventually encountered circumstances their creators had not anticipated. Walking home through shadows that held no menace, Miss Marple reflected that the village would heal, though the healing would leave scars in the form of increased wariness. Perhaps that was not entirely unfortunate. Communities, like individuals, sometimes required reminders that eternal vigilance remained the price of the trust that made peaceful coexistence possible. The bell that had rung after midnight would be remembered not for its mechanical deception, but for its ultimate revelation of truth. Justice had prevailed through careful observation, patient reasoning, and understanding that human nature, however cleverly disguised, inevitably revealed itself to those who knew how to watch and wait and listen for the small inconsistencies that betrayed larger deceptions.